We'll call the meeting to order. The first thing we'll do is acknowledge the fact that you were okay with receiving notice of this meeting by email.
Did, Your Honor.
Yes, sir. Want to make sure of that. The next thing we will do is ask for approval of the minutes from our January 25th meeting. There's only two of you. Move approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? We'll now have an update from the March 6th primary. Take it away.
Good afternoon, thank you. So I prepared a little summary of the report that was sent to the commission containing all the updates that we're going to discuss today. So I'll go through the highlights of that report. If I am skipping anything that you have found important, please feel free to stop me and ask me questions. So the first part of the report addresses elections projects, one that was completed, the March 6th primary, and two upcoming ones, the May 5th entities election and the May 22nd primary runoff. So I'm going to go over the primary election first and talk about what happened on March 6th. In summary, we can report that we completed the election with no major issues and complete normality. We had 1 million, almost 1.1 million voters that were eligible to vote on March 6th, out of which almost 185,000 cast ballots. So that's a 16.89% turnout for the election, which compared to the last primary is quite an increase. The turnout on that election was distributed almost 60% Republican Party and 40% Democrat Party. The numbers are there on the screen and on the report. We also took a look at how those votes were distributed by how people voted absentee, early, and election day. Interesting fact, in case anybody wants to keep track of it, more than half the voters that participated did so before election day. And the behavior is pretty similar between both parties. If you look at the percentages, both parties are around 9% absentee. That's where you have the biggest difference, half a point. But in general terms, voters in both parties are around 43.5% for early voting and 47.3, 47.6 for election day. So it's a pretty symmetrical distribution, pretty interesting. There doesn't seem to be a preference on either party. So after the election, these are the races that are going to the runoff. Important for when we get to the runoff, summary of the report, we have countywide coverage races. On the Democrat, we have the governor and the U.S. representatives, and so do, and the same thing on the Republican primary.
Do we have that slide in our record?
Can we have what?
We don't have that slide in our record, do we?
That, the breakdown of the absentee, no, I'll amend the report and include it. Can we make note of that? So what did we learn from that? Even though there were no major issues, we do have things that we've learned that we are incorporating, and I wanted to share some of the things that we are doing to address that. Voter complaints, there were 3 that were probably the most recurrent, even though there were many. These were the 3 that seemed to come back the most frequently. Difficulties finding their polling place. So voters did call us and say, I don't know where I vote, I'm trying to find out, I'm confused. So what are we doing? In the short term, we're trying to increase outreach. We've done a lot of activity on our Facebook page. We're going to work with the Public Information Office or other social media like Nextdoor, just try to reach out and put out the message on how you find your polling place. And we'll talk about how that polling place changes on a couple of slides from now. We are doing some changes to our search tools. So now on the website, we're trying to make it more explicit that you may have more than one election in which you're eligible to vote. And so people don't just assume that if you go to this school on March 6th, you have to go to the same place on May 5th and on the same place on the 22nd. That may change. So we're trying to make that more explicit. In the long term, question that I would like to start discussing with stakeholders is the vote center model something that we want to explore and bring forward in Tarrant County? And the reason I'm bringing that forward, raising that point at this moment is, in the vote center model, you don't have a polling place assigned. You can go anywhere in the county and vote. So the problem altogether goes away. Anywhere there's a vote center, you can cast your ballot on election day. pretty much like you do in,
Does the state allow that?
We have
yes.
several counties that
do that.
that they run the pilots on
Yes,
right
sir.
now. Lubbock County, I think Harris County is actually going to it.
And we currently allow that to go on during early voting.
Yes, sir.
Don't allow it on voting day.
Correct. Now, the thing about that is that if we go to the voting centers like that, the first election that we go to, we have to have at least 60% of the numbers of polling places in that first one, and we can gradually move that down.
Meaning if the last election we had 200 polling places, we have to have 120 the
Correct.
first time we do that? Gotcha.
And we can move it down, but I don't think we ever move it down below 40%.
I don't know the details yet, Your Honor. That's part of the research that has to do. We have to come up with a precise plan, numbers, the whole thing to understand how, what timeline and how much it would cost to transition. But I think it's a topic worth start exploring right now in our discussions.
Sorry. And I'm assuming that's a commissioner's court call.
No? We have, at least in the past, I mean, we've discussed it a couple of times with the party chairs, because we do feel like that's you know, it will significantly reduce, and that would be the goal, is to not have, I think we had, what, 600 sites
And
in the primary election? How many locations?
600, do you remember the number? 320 combined. We have close to 700 precincts, but then they're combined depending on the election. So we had 320 boards and 170-something
Okay.
locations. The number.
So what we would do is, I mean, my thought would be, unless, you know, the parties just say, no, there's no way, would be to try to reduce the polling places prior to going to the voting centers. And then when we go to the voting centers, hit our 60%. But you know, I think that there is a lot of confusion, and in the past, I thought at least that we did not have places where we early voted and voted on election day at the same place. But I've been told that there were a number of places where we did that.
We have a few, yes, we do have some.
But you know, that's,
And, you know, we have to really prepare a plan for this. There are other considerations, not just number, but also geographical location, accessibility. You don't want to have too small of a vote center downtown where probably most people will use it. One of the key things in vote centers to consider is you are no longer planning in terms of where you live, but where it's convenient for you to vote. So you may have places where, even though nobody resides, like downtown, you have to be prepared to receive a lot of traffic and be able to take care of a lot of people. So the whole distribution revolves a lot around density of and capacity of service. So it's a long conversation that we have to start.
And
If
you have paper ballots on election day, so that means every site has to have, no?
We have to change over a voting equipment as part of it.
So we won't have that anymore.
we'll get to
If we
the,
went to this model, we wouldn't, okay, so that's a non-issue.
we have to, yeah, I'll get to that when we get to the new voting equipment, but that's some of the things we have to consult with Secretary of State to make sure that we procure equipment that's adequate, but we'll get to that in a few slides. So that's something I'll leave there. We'll start the conversation. You'll start hearing us from us regarding that. The other complaint we heard recurrently, why was my mail ballot or why was my provisional ballot rejected? I was told that this would count. So we're trying to make sure, we even had a call saying that the instructions on the mail ballot, the carrier, were confusing, and so people would put 2 sleeve envelopes inside one carrier, and so we don't know whose ballot it is. In that sort of situation, we're trying to make sure that the instructions are clear. They're provided by state, but we're reviewing it, seeing if there's anything we can do to enhance it. And poll worker training, we're making sure that we refresh, and poll workers do not commit with voters that a provisional ballot will count. Some voters have told us, the poll worker told me that if I did a provisional, it would count. We cannot promise that. There are, requirements in the law. So that sort of thing to make sure that voters are well informed. We also had a few calls and emails about the layout of the parties in the precinct and the physical location. So some people would say, why is it that I went in and I found one party close to the door and the other one in a in a section of the room that's not so visible when you come in? Is that preference? So we don't have control over that, but we're trying to, again, talk to the poll workers and say, in a case of a primary, let's make sure we, if possible, if the room allows, or even if we have to consider alternate locations so everybody's kind of in a more balanced layout and there is no misimpression of preference or first choice. Poll worker training, there were a lot of remarks about the quality of the training. This is a reality that, you know, I've noticed and I've discussed with staff, and we know that we can do better. So what are we doing in the short term? Obviously, when someone tells us this page is not clear enough, or this could have a better chart for this, we're including in the manuals. In the midterm, one thing we started doing, when we've done 2 sessions already, is focus groups with poll workers. So we invited one evening from 6 to, it was almost 9 p.m., 10 judges from early voting, and they told us what they thought, what we could do better, what we have been doing well, make sure we stay in it. So we're trying to get out all that feedback. We did a second session with election day judges, 8 judges as well, to tell us, you know, what they thought about the process, and pretty much we're collecting all of that to identify ways to do it better. In the long term, I do think that we have to work on a new training program, and one thing that I will eventually ask county administration is if we can have a new position of a training coordinator or supervisor manager, someone who eats, breathes, and understands training techniques, training methods, who helps our office keep a constant and uniform way of developing manuals, materials, and everything that's got to do with training too. That effort, it says long-term, not because we don't think it has value right now. We'll get to this since we're procuring new voting equipment. I don't see a lot of value in undertaking a lot of effort this year to redo all the manuals and all the training to then redo it again when we get the new voting equipment. So we might line it up, hang on until the end of the year, and then do all of this effort for when we get the new equipment. Other issues, failures and replacements are becoming more frequent, more expensive to solve. Before I came here, I double-checked the numbers. We have spent all of our funding for prevent maintenance according to the budget, and we had $30,000 for out-of-warranty repairs, and so far we've spent $44,000. We've actually had to incur extra expenses. That's to be expected. This is very old equipment, just a highlight there. And the other issue we want to highlight is we had an issue with our signage vendor. We received a letter from the Department of Justice requiring us to include Vietnamese in all our voter materials. One of the materials we had to replace were the signs for the polling locations. So it would say, vote here, vote aquí, in Vietnamese. I don't know how to say it in Vietnamese. So that was put out in an RFP. It was bid out. We had a recommendation for a vendor, but it was chosen for financial considerations to go with the cheapest. That vendor did not finish the order. We got some of the signs in, and on the deadline to receive the rest in time for the primary, they failed to arrive. We reached out, we did everything we could. The vendor just didn't show up for like 5 days. We activated our contingency plan. We printed Vietnamese text, taped it on the old signs, got them out just to avoid any liability with the Department of Justice. And we activated with purchasing a plan B. We went to a secondary vendor who delivered actually ahead of what they could. Not in time for the primary, but ahead to what they committed to in the emergency. We can follow up with purchasing if you want to.
I have a question
Yes,
about
go ahead, sir.
the Department of Justice mandate to put stuff in Vietnamese. Do you have any idea what that cost?
What was the order on the signs, do you remember?
I think it was about 35 to 45,000. I can't remember exactly what the signs were for, but these were all outside signs. These were
That was
outside
for
polling
outside signs?
Yes, sir.
Was there any other cost incurred?
signs. No, but,
There was translations
There-
that we did prior to
right.
that.
Right.
Ballpark?
Man hours on translating our materials. I don't have the number. I can follow up with that.
Purchasing.
I know that Stephen had $10,000 put in the budget for that before, and that was gone within a short period of time, and our girls in the office have been doing most of it now.
The last one, I think, was like 7,000, sometime around in the period that he was there, and I know that they had some more before that, so we would have to go back to purchasing
But the second vendor that was actually the one that was next in line actually finished the order and finished it early, which was the one we asked them to go with, but they went with the cheapest one to start with. They were actually an election vendor.
So let me just clarify something. That's for the signs, that supplementary cost for putting the signs. For the rest of printed materials, website, all of that, we actually used to have an RFP with a translating services company. But we also hired Vietnamese-speaking employees who are now helping us and staff. So to answer your question about the cost, I would have to gather all the payments we did to the translation company and estimate the man-hours put in by our translators to give you a total of what it costs to implement that requirement from DOJ.
Can you do that?
Yeah, we can.
You know, and I guess one of the comments that I would make is, they being, I guess you're saying purchasing decided who that was gonna be?
Yes.
And it was approved by the court?
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure the election board shouldn't have been in there someplace. Now, I know that we were told that everything was, you know, that we had everything going.
They were on track the last time we met.
And so.
Like I said,
We need to get into that, and, obviously, if we need to have some decision or some way of being able to, of course, that purchasing, that company will never be used again, period. I don't care if they're half the cost of the next one.
Understood.
And the reason I asked the question, and by the time anything's done about it, I won't be sitting here, and it's probably not even an election commission decision anyway, is I think somebody, I don't know if that's Commissioner's Court or Election Board Commission, should get some kind of legal opinion on, do you really have to comply with that? And/or could you challenge it? Because we're talking about $50,000.
At least.
$40,000, $50,000 at least every other year. If not, add another 10,000 or 15,000 for every municipal one. I mean, we're talking over a small period of time, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for something that, I mean, nobody is not voting because there's not a Vietnamese sign at the church says, come vote here. I mean, it just doesn't happen. But anyway.
Some of that, just to be fairness, some of that cost is one time. The signs we wouldn't have to do per election. And some of the
Yeah, that's
translations
true.
will be absorbed by our
What do the
staff.
signs say?
Vote here,
So it doesn't,
handicap parking, all the indications that you have,
okay,
in a primary, for
Okay.
Do
example.
any campaigning past
I didn't
this
think of
marker.
that.
The
Yeah.
distance markers, all that has to be in all three
Yeah.
languages.
Mostly, and there's another thing we have to look at. There's a very clear requirement on the federal law on the language assistance for
I wouldn't
what it
use
has to do with the
words very
voter.
clear in federal law ever again in a sentence, so, but anyway, I understand.
I mean, what the federal law says, anything that has to do with the voter experience has to be offered in the languages required by the Department of Justice. So we have to make sure that that line is very clear, and we don't, anything that is not part of the voting experience is not an effort that we incurred into.
And we
The
incurred
other-
that because our population percentage went over a certain amount.
Exactly. And
Vietnamese.
that's something we have to, I would say, probably talk to other counties who have more complex experiences.
Do you know what the percent is by any chance?
I don't know. You mean for demand, for requiring the
Yeah.
language? Why? I thought you meant in Tarrant County.
If you want me to, I will forward you a copy of the letter they sent us, because it explains it in the letter of
Yeah.
how they came up
Yeah,
with why
so-
we need it.
I
I
just,
would
so
love to do
then,
that.
if there's 5% Indian, we're gonna have to put it in that, and then there's 5%, and this never stops.
And that's where I was going. It
So we're
won't
gonna have
hurt.
signs that are 12 feet tall in 10 years to comply with every, I mean, you know,
That's where I was going. I would like to, in plans, preparations for future growth of the county, talk to other counties. LA has 10 languages they have to support. And, it'd be interesting to see how they optimize and where the line is, because again, like the envelope right now is pretty wordy for mail ballots. And that's just 3 languages. So if in the next 10 years, we have to add Chinese, Arabic,
you name it.
Portuguese, we're going to have a legal size envelope to mail a ballot. So we have to learn about this, and we have to start looking into the future and seeing what's the best way to handle multi-language extensive capabilities.
And part of that could be fighting it. So anyway, all right, I digress.
So that's the last of the issues I wanted to highlight from the primary election. Again, overall, it was a very successful, quiet, project, like any project, has opportunities of improvement, but we believe that we can remedy them with relatively little work. So what's coming up? The entities election. May 5th, 37 contracting entities. You have the breakdown there in the reports. Because of the coverage of the entities in the county, it's basically a countywide election. Out of the at this point, 1,090,000 voters, 1,045,000 are eligible or live within the districts, the district boundaries that have an election. So we will have 45 early voting locations, 176 election day locations, almost $1 million estimated on the contracts. And so far, only $60,000 have been collected out of $745,000 of deposit. That's not unusual from what I understand, because we mail out the contract at the end of March, and most of these entities are waiting for their April meeting to approve and send the payments, and their board meetings.
So why don't we send out the contracts earlier?
We can, but I asked the entities, this was something new for me to learn about, and because it's an estimate. A lot of entities drop in and out. So they say, I want to have an election, then they don't. So when we started when I first got here in February, I think we had like 58 entities listed as possible. So the cost per entity would have been a lot smaller than what it ends up being. And so they have told us we prefer to have a closer estimate than an earlier inaccurate estimate. That's what they told me anyway, and I figured if it's been done that way in the past, we can keep it. That's an item we can discuss here.
Well, their deadline for filing was February this year, wasn't it?
No, they have a March deadline to
There's an early
Withdraw.
tie-in and a late tie-in.
exactly.
So if there's a special vacancy election,
Okay.
there's a late tie-in that basically we're waiting to find out if there's not going to be another special election due to a vacancy.
Okay. So then otherwise it's March and we get the contracts out in March. So you're right, I see what you're saying.
We could,
A lot
but
of them are not gonna wanna sign a contract until they know they're gonna have to have an election.
and because in this case, they dropped the number of entities, they would have been paying in a deposit that
we
probably
get
would have
to
even made
surprise
us
the
give them a
ones that are
refund.
left.
Sorry?
Then we get to surprise the ones that are left and raise the price.
Right.
Okay.
Do y'all know if there are any cities or ISDs in Tarrant County that don't have us do their elections?
That are not having an election in May? Yes.
No, I know there's some that are not having elections because nobody ran or it was unopposed. I'm talking about are there any that do their own, even if they have an election, does anybody know?
Yeah, City of Burleson, Burleson ISD, City of Crowley.
They all do their own.
Now, they also have very little, Burleson has very little of their town that is in Tarrant County. So do they have Johnson County do it and just oversee everything?
Burleson holds their own because Johnson County won't do even year elections.
What? They don't have enough
Basically, that was
equipment.
part of, yeah, they don't have to.
See,
That
that's
was,
the reason that Fort Worth moved to, well, no, I guess Fort Worth did move, didn't they? Yeah, Fort Worth's having a bond election. But their council elections are on, odd number of years.
Right.
So several of them moved to that. Because we didn't have enough equipment. Because you take the equipment out. I think the way it was in the past, now it may have changed, but the equipment that we had in the primary, it's not cleared up and freed. I think you have to hold on to that equipment, don't you, through the runoff?
That's a good point. Theoretically, if we don't get the waiver from the state, but we got it. We asked the state, they put out the procedure, and so we can
Clear the machine.
clear the machines from May 5th and use them for the runoff of the primary. Otherwise, we would have had to rent equipment or find a different solution for it. So I just zoomed in the map a little bit. That's the locations of the early voting sites. It's not really, doesn't look that good on this screen. It's on the website, but just the southwest
The
corner
blue
is
dots,
basically,
I'm assuming are what you're saying are the,
yeah, it's
what's
pretty
that
much,
little red dot over there?
that's a temporary early voting site, the UAT. UAT? I say that right? UAT. It's the only one that hasn't it's not going to be open. UTA, thank you.
Don't say UNT, because that's a different one.
Apologize for that. So where are we on this project? Early voting starts next Monday, April 23rd. We've started dispatching equipment today. Because we just had the primary, we're not requiring the judges to be trained. However, they will, when they pick up their equipment, have a refreshment session on provisional, certain topics that we always do when they pick up equipment. We've started mailing absentee ballots on March 21st, and as of Friday, when I did the numbers for this presentation, 18% of them were back. That's 4,000 out of 22,000. That includes all the annuals and.
Many of them came up from Forest Hill.
Is that?
Forest Hill.
I don't have the breakdown of them, but you can share them if you want. Tomorrow, the ballot board convenes to start processing and verifying signatures. For Election Day, we've completed all our testing of the equipment, public test, LNA test, logic and accuracy test. We've got all consumables, signs ready, and the training, we're just having 2 sessions to refresh poll workers and new clerks and judges. So overall, we don't see any risk for completing the May 5th. Doesn't mean we're not looking into it carefully, but just we don't see anything to be worried about at this time. If we stick to it, we should be fine. Then there's a primary runoff, May 22nd. So the highlight for the primary was after the primary election, traditionally my understanding, apologize, I don't have the time in Tarrant County, but my understanding is that both parties were able to sit down and agree on a common list of polling places. This time, that was not the case. So what's different this time from the last 10 years is you will have some sites where you will have only one party, one of the 2 parties. Okay? So the final result was 148 polling places will have the 2 parties there. 8 of them will have only the Republican judge and clerks for the precincts that were there, and those, the Democratic Party consolidated their voters to one of the other 148 places. And the same thing happened on the Democratic side. So they have 19 locations where they decided to stay, and the Republican Party decided to consolidate them somewhere else. I've included in your report the list, but in essence, I'm not going to try to pronounce the first name. If you go to the Morningside Elementary School,
Van Zandt.
Van Zandt, there you go.
Van Zandt Grant.
If you go to that school and you're a Democrat, you vote there. If you're a Republican, you will be told to go to where the precinct 1005 is consolidated by the Republican Party. And the same thing with the Green Valley Elementary School. If you're a Republican, you vote there. If you're a Democrat, you'll be routed to another polling place. There are 127,700 voters in these locations out of the 1,045,000 in the county. So, because this is different, this is our concern. This is where we see a potential risk, not a huge risk, but a potential risk is you have a voter who will go to a polling place on May 5th. Then depending, those 127,000 voters, depending on what runoff they want to participate, they will go to one or another. And then if there's a runoff for the local elections, they'll go to a different polling place on June 16, a possibly different one. So there will be potentially up to 3 different polling places for some people in a little over a month. What are we doing to mitigate that? County administration was helpful enough to appoint a PIO person to work with me, and so we have to structure a campaign to outreach, basically inform people and explain to people very well where you vote and how to find that information. Again, going back to the lesson learned from the primary. So we've been talking about possible targeted mailings, postcard maybe, or letter to each person saying, please pay close attention because in your case, depending on your party, you have to go to one polling place or another. And this was just initial brainstorming before we had the final numbers. Now we can actually go in and do the plan. Media presence, I know the county has access to Nextdoor, which gives you targeted messaging to people who use it. So you could actually go straight into those neighborhoods, those precincts, and say, please find this information. Facebook as well, and other social media. We've also started making modifications to the website.
Can I, let me stop
yes,
you real
sir.
quick. So just get some feedback here from our fellow commission members. I think everyone in this room has experienced March or whenever we have our primary, May, how it's been in the past. You go to one place and then 2 years later, that place doesn't do it for whatever reason. It's not big enough. There's changes that happen pretty regularly. Are y'all comfortable with the ones where if you're a Republican, you don't go to the Democrat place? Are y'all comfortable with sending out postcards to everyone in there? That seems to be an exorbitant cost. And just so you guys will know, and anybody else in the room that doesn't know, and y'all can correct me on the numbers, we went down Republican primary locations. I think we took away 45 for the runoff. And multiple ones of the ones that we didn't agree with on the Democrats, we had 3 voters show up in the primary at one of them. We had 1 voter show up at one of the primary, the primary in one of the places, and we didn't want to staff 3 people for 1 voter or 3 voters. In this runoff election, and I didn't do a close enough look at this, I'm not even sure, I guess there's only 2 countywide elections, am I right? So there's 3. There's probate court, tax assessor, and the 3, 42nd?
42nd.
Okay, so those 3 things are going to be, if we got 3 voters for everything, I doubt we'll get a single one show back up for that. So that's why we shut it down. Me personally, every time there's some kind of change, we send out postcards to tell people. I'm not comfortable with that, or I don't think that's money well spent, but feel free to chime in if you agree or
I
disagree.
don't disagree with that. How much are the postcards gonna cost us?
My recollection is probably 10 cents postage, probably 2 or 3 pennies a postcard if you get them really cheap. So we're talking $13,000, 15. So it pretty much be the savings of cutting down on the poll workers and stations. So, and I think we talked about this at some point. We want to find a solution where if we aimed for, saving some taxpayers' money, we actually do.
Can we actually send the cards to the people who voted in the,
We can do a lot of things. We don't have to do 127,000. We could do per household, and usually that cuts down, because if you have husband and wife who voted together, you send 1 postcard. So now you're
or if
talking,
we just send it to the people who voted in the primary?
that's what we're going to open up now and come up, my next step is to come up with numbers and figure what this is going,
That makes
would cost, right. One step I skipped there, the media presence. One thing that we talked about was probably simply showing up in some news highlights after May 5th. We don't want to do this before May 5th because we don't want to confuse people. So we really have to time it, if possible, to say, okay, municipal elections are over. Now we start informing about May 22nd and so on. So we don't, tell people, if you're a Republican, you're going to go vote in Green Valley Elementary before May 5th, and we confuse them, and that's not their polling place and things like that. So we have to design this campaign, this informative campaign, really well to actually make it helpful and not more confusing.
Runoffs, go ahead.
Go ahead, no, you go ahead.
Runoffs don't generally generate new voters. It's usually the ones that voted in the primary come back a second time. There's some, but not a lot.
Okay. Yeah, we can, again, let me extract the voting history of everybody and figure out what it looks like in terms of cost.
And I'm not trying to pick you apart here, but when you want to do the postcards to the people in the areas where they have a Democrat location and a Republican location that are separate, right?
Right, that would be the intent too.
Then, then why not a postcard if for the other 45 that we dropped, you don't go here, so we better get you at some point, you got to be responsible for knowing where to go vote.
Right,
Without the county having to spend tens of thousands of dollars every time there's a change. So just
correct. And again, this is the kind of thing that, want to repeat, but the vote centers would help alleviate and solve. Because now it doesn't matter, you're dropping off your kid at school, there's a vote center, you vote, you move on, it doesn't matter where you live. But this particular problem, let us come up with some options and then quantify them and figure what I can spend. I don't have a gold potluck at the end of the rainbow to just pull money out, so I have to figure out what I can do as well. What we have done, modifications to the website. So now there used to go in and there was a single set of orange blocks saying, click here to find your polling place. Now we're splitting it, and as you can see, you have now local elections and primary runoff. So there's 2 polling place searches, just trying to make it more explicit to voters. We have certain limitations of what we can do on the website to stay within the IT parameters of the website, so we're going with what we can do. We've already changed the voter lookup, and I should have also talked about this, because traditionally there had been a single list and an agreement between the parties. Some of the administrative tasks of setting the back end up were done assuming that it was like a one list, one project thing. And we talked about this with the party chairs when this decision was being made. We overcame that hurdle. We turned it into 2 separate projects. So now when you look yourself up and the voter lookup, you have to choose which primary runoff, and that'll tell you your polling location. Next step will be to work with our staff to make sure we have a phone script. So when people start calling, we have a very neutral script that informs you that your polling place depends on the party you want to vote for without, creating any misperception of you're telling me to vote A or B or anything like that. So that'll be a very standardized message and reply that our staff will have. We don't see a lot of risk here. We just have to work hard to avoid poor customer satisfaction with our voters. That's going to be our challenge for the runoff. Just making sure we get that message there to avoid confusion. And that's my update on the election projects, the 3 we have. I didn't talk about June 16, the entities runoff. We have to wait for the election to see what goes, although Karen is telling me one of the entities is pretty certain they'll have one, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The next update I wanted to give you, unless you have any questions right now, new equipment purchasing. So we have 2 main topics to cover here. One is ongoing, is electronic poll books, and the other one is an objective for the end of the year, new voting equipment. So for the electronic poll books, first thing to know is we are going to buy these with money coming from the state, from the program known as Chapter 19. This is money that the state assigns to the counties for enhancing voter registration activities, technology. It's awarded to the counties, and every 2 years it expires, so it's a use it or lose it thing. The funds we have available were assigned in 2016. They expire August this year, and that's one of the important things to remember, because I came in just at the time where that plan had to get going, or we were not going to be able to complete it, put it out for bid, award it, and implement it in time before forfeiting the money. The way it works is we have to spend the money first and then ask the state for reimbursement. So that makes our timeline even smaller, because we have time to get the money back. I can't spend money that I'm not going to be reimbursed for. So what's our timeline? March 2nd, we made a huge effort. We got the RFP out online. We had a pre-bid conference on March 9. 7 vendors came to this room. They're on the screen there. On March 29, they submitted their bids. ES&S sent a no-bid letter. They were not going to bid on the poll books, and No Inc. joined with Hart. They had a joint offer. Basically, Hart presented the offer for No Inc. technology. We completed our evaluation of the 5 bids submitted. This is a panel made of 6 election staff members, including myself and Karen Lawrence, and 4 IT panel members. So it's a total of 10 people doing this. During that evaluation process, we determined that 2 of the vendors had mandatory requirements that did not comply with. I have masked, if you want to call it that way, the names, because purchasing says we haven't completed it, we can't, that will be made public altogether when the process finishes. So those 3 vendors were invited for demonstrations. We started this morning with the first one. They're going to be conducted today, Wednesday, and Thursday from 8 to 12 in our offices. So by Friday, once we've completed and the panel decides if any of the scores is to be adjusted based on what we saw on the demos, I'll be issuing a letter of recommendation to purchasing for one of the vendors. And if it all goes well, May 15th, we would have it approved by Commissioners Court, and the goal is to have it implemented, signed off, and received by the end of June, so we have time to pay the vendor, get all the documentation, and submit the claim to the state, and get our money back in August.
And what are these for?
Electronic poll books, so instead of the paper book where people sign, you will now have a touchscreen similar to the one we have here on our desk, where people would scan their ID, or the poll worker would look you up, give you the screen to sign on the screen, and that would also make sure you have the appropriate ballot type given to you. If you don't vote in this precinct, it will tell you where to go. Some of them even offer to print a map and step-by-step directions on how to get there, and even details on walk-in on the side door, depending on how we configure it. They will also help in collecting voter history. So instead of spending 4, 5, 6 days scanning paper books we mark, Beth voted, Karen voted, Hyder voted, you would just extract the data, plug it in the system, and all your voter history is immediately in. So it will save us a lot of time
So there's not an upload link at the location that uploads into the internet and then comes down to your,
There is. They are online, because if you vote in one precinct and you go to another one, physically in a different location, it will say you've already voted.
and we did not have that ability in the past.
We have it only for early voting. On election day, we have paper poll books.
I guess what I'm trying to determine is whether or not, we've kind of said in the past that our voting is not online, therefore it's not hackable.
The voting equipment is not part of this. This is just the work the judges are doing right now on paper poll books. And then they would authorize you to go to the voting machine, which is completely disconnected from this system, to cast your ballots.
But it's a check-in, so
Yes,
but
sir.
if I check in at one of our early voting locations, and then someone hacks into the system and shows that I didn't check in, then when I get to the next one, or the next one, or the next one, I can vote multiple times. Now, what will show that to be the case, and therefore get me in trouble?
The poll book on the second location would still say you don't vote here. You have to go there. So if you want to vote here, it's a
But it's early
provisional.
voting, so I can vote anywhere.
Sorry?
Isn't it early voting?
In early voting, you can vote anywhere, that's right.
So then
But
that
that's
ain't gonna
online
work.
anyway right now, so it'd have at least the same safeguards and precautions we have right now. If you go to an early voting site and then go to another one, the second site knows that you voted already because they are online. So it's
they're
not,
hackable.
it's not different than what we have right now.
You're
We have,
saying they're not hackable.
I'm saying they have a lot of safeguards, and
Well, she's shaking her head saying they're not hackable.
We just asked the question this morning when we had the vendor presentation. And Darren May assured us that the way that they're doing this, they are very safe, because they would only be able to pick up certain RFPs and things that we're putting in there ourselves. In other words, it's like there's only gonna be like 2 things that it would actually recognize as the actual way that it would, I know what you're asking. So
are you asking about the current solution or the one we're looking at?
so it's only gonna take to like the application from a certain place that we have preset in there. In other words, if you're doing it from somewhere else, it's gonna know that that's not the one we're supposed to be getting it from,
Okay?
if that makes
Again,
sense.
it's not different than the safeguards and the processes and the policies that IT has in place right now for the solution we have. What we're doing is we're extending it to election day to allow the poll workers to have more efficient tools and eliminate a lot of the work we have to do in the back. But just in concept, it's the same, it's a similar thing to what we have for early voting already.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay, continue.
So if it all goes well and we can stick to the timeline, which is the biggest risk this project has, not, anything delaying it and not being able to do it, not because any technical difficulty, but because of impossibility to get refunded in time, we'd be done by the end of June. Now,
Why did you
Yes,
not
sir.
have anybody from the parties on this purchasing decision-making team?
to be honest, it was never discussed with purchasing, Your Honor.
Well, it needs to be discussed, in my opinion, it needs to be discussed in the future. And when we're dealing with things like this, I prefer that the parties at least have some representation, unless you can think of a reason why y'all either wouldn't want to be a part of it or shouldn't be a part of it. You're gonna take the heat.
Yeah, I wonder if the level of understanding and time that you would need would be there. I mean, just sitting in the room, having, saying it sounds good to me, I don't see anything wrong with it. Me personally, this is one where I'm okay with the way he's doing it, but
I'd like for
I'll
you
take
to-
the recommendation,
I would
though, and at least ask.
Especially as you get into looking at equipment.
Okay, I'll take the recommendation, at least ask next time the party chairs. Make sure, and like he said, if he would have said no, then, but at least they would have been consulted.
Because my guess is the people who are sitting in there from purchasing know less about it
no,
than,
that's probably smart, yeah.
and y'all know the things to watch for and the things to, that you feel like may have been problems in the past.
For what it's worth, we did, this did come up with our focus groups of judges, and from the election day and early voting, they sounded pretty excited about it, just the concept of getting rid of the paper poll books.
Good.
So, we had done the estimation initially on $250,000 available for buying the electronic poll books, but some of the expenses we planned for have been less than we anticipated to use from that, so we actually have around $350,000 available. The way the RFP was written was on a base number, which we thought 150. So looks like we're gonna be able to get a few more and speed up the process of equipping Tarrant County 100% with electronic poll books. 150 don't cover the county. We do get a similar amount assigned 2018, so we probably will buy at least 2 batches. Then we'll have to see if we can use some of the voting equipment funds we'll talk about now, or some of the federal grant to complete buying the entire
So
set of
your
poll
estimate
books.
for the total cost to complete everything?
Between $750 and $1 million, including licenses in the next 3 years. Is there a cost that will be recurrent? When you buy the poll book, you have to buy a back-end application to manage all of this, and you will pay for that annually from now on. So that's part of the cost that has to be added to the department's budget. And that's where we are with that. The next update, voting machines. So I started with the county, and this county has set aside money for replacing voting equipment, which is great news. There are only 3 vendors we can buy from in the state of Texas. You have to be certified. You can't go out and buy from anybody you like. You have to be certified by state. There are only 3 vendors: ES&S, HART, and Dominion Voting. This is the quote the reference you have on the report I gave you lists 3 vendors and models. That was taken from the Secretary of State's website. I know that they haven't updated this particular page that I took this list of models and parts from, but it's one of these 3 solutions. Also, Dominion Voting, the solution they have that I know of is one they acquired from an old vendor, Premier, which I don't know if they support, so unless they have plans to certify something new, that wouldn't be an option for us. So we're basically down to 2 or 3 options. As I said, the county has set aside $14 million capital budget for us to use for this. One thing that we want to keep in mind as we figure out which way we're going to go is, if the vote center model is an option that we want to pursue down the road, that we want to be smart when we buy our equipment. We wouldn't want to spend $14 million this year and look back 2 or 3 years from now and say, oh, now we can't go vote centers because our equipment won't let us. So you'll see the timeline in a minute, why some things are pushed back to give us time to figure it out. $14 million is a lot of money. We want to conduct an open process, make sure we involve parties, stakeholders, watch groups, anybody, and basically collect feedback. This is what people will be voting for the next 15 years probably, so make sure everybody's as close to happy as we can get them. In essence, one thing that I want to put in my staff's head when we do this, as we work through this, is I don't want us to just choose one of the 3 and figure out how to use their equipment. I want us to think, how do we see Tarrant County voting in the next 15 years, make it very clear in our heads how we want to serve our voters, and then based on that, make a selection of which one of these three options is the one that best fits that plan. So we're going to work it not, let's go look at the three and get the shiniest or the cheapest, or, you know, let's think what we want to do, and then let's go and see how they fit into that plan.
Make sure your RFP is written in such a way as it allows you to do something other than just the price, so make sure there's a weighted.
Yeah, actually, and that's my first time in a timeline. We're here on April 16th, so the first thing I want to do is make sure we work with purchasing and legal, understand how this has to be structured because of the amount of money, because of the level of scrutiny it's going to go. So we want to make sure it's all properly laid out. There are no questions about how that money was spent. There are alternatives. I know the county has some financial options and some legal figures that can be used, like these agreements inter-county. But again, I have to work with purchasing and legal to make sure that it's a very clear process and there's no questioning about it. And that it's in the best interest of the county's taxpayers. So if we can complete that and we have a clear plan of this is how we're going to do it, if it's an RFP, if it's a DRI, a cooperative buying, whatever it is, by mid-May, we can take the month of June to start then, because even the figure of the bidding process, RFP, whatever it is, conditions how you can approach vendors and invite them to do demos. Like, for example, in an RFP, once it's out, you can't have contacts or demos. You have to wait until after the offers are in and all of these things. So once we figure out how it's going to happen, we can start having these events to bring the public in and hear what they want. We also have to see what limitations we may have if we want to go to vote center models, paper, no paper, full electronic, et cetera. Prepare purchasing documents. If we have to do a full RFP writing, this is the worst case, mid-September. It takes a lot of time to write an RFP of this size and this level of detail properly, make sure we're covering everything we need. I've also been contacted by Dallas County. There was an initiative before I came here for counties to write an RFP together. The last thing I talked about with the assistant elections administrator there was that they had a draft and they would be sharing it soon. So it'd be interesting to see what's in that document already and see if we just want to adhere to it or not. So if we can complete that, we should be getting offers from the vendors mid-October, evaluate offers and award contract by mid-November, end of November. We go for the holidays with a vendor chosen and waiting for equipment. The goal here is to do this before the end of the year and use 2019 as a transition year, not get creative on 2020 in a presidential year. I believe this is enough time to do it properly without risking any rushes into anything. We have a full year to conduct a very calm process, well thought. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, but I don't see any risk in completing this by the end of the year, having the funds available and the team available.
I think it's important that we be ready to go into 19, do our municipal elections, do maybe whatever November elections. Those will be small elections and will give us a chance to test the equipment.
If we stick to this timeline, we wouldn't have it by November, but we will have at least identified a solution.
We'll have it by the November 19th.
Oh, November 19th, yeah. In fact, depending on who we choose and how it's delivered, if we have elections in March, May next year, we may be able to do a few pilots. It will be a major, huge step for us. We're going to have to rewrite every procedure, retrain everybody. It's a huge step. So we want to do it 2019. That's what we have on the big purchases that are going on. And my last part, general office updates, just some other things that have been going on. I think this was the last item on the agenda. IT security. One of the first things I did when I got to the office was to have a conference call with the county CIO, Mr. Inchopa Ayafor. I think I pronounced it right. Talk about security of our elections, make sure our platform's up to date, that we're following all our policies, that if there is anything that had to be done, we would start it early. So 2 days after that, February 23rd, Mr. Darren May, Senior Security Officer for the county, was in my office with another IT representative. We went over everything that we've been doing, and we've been doing conducting certain activities related to that. All of our staff has been retrained and updated on IT security and policies that they have to abide by in the county. The security officer has visited our offices on election night and a number of times randomly just to look at it and tell us, I'm seeing something I don't like, or I'm seeing stuff I like. And we also confirmed with them in that meeting that there were recommendations from Department of Homeland Security and FBI on 2016. They were implemented, they were updated, and Aaron said he was going to reach out to them to see if in the summer they could come back in again, reassess everything, make sure we're ready for November. We are a big county. He always says that we are a target. We are an attractive target, so we have to be up to date on all these things. The three of us actually also attended a webinar on voting equipment security from our current vendor, Hart. We have this equipment until next year, so we might as well just make sure we are not overlooking anything, especially Karen and I being new. Office safety. We've been working on general office items, defibrillators located where they're more accessible. Some of them Karen noticed before I came here. This has been something she's been championing of the office safety. We're behind locked doors or in places where if someone had an emergency, you wouldn't really be able to get to them quickly. You would have to have someone help you and make it slower. So we've also had staff trained on CPR and defibrillator techniques. Extinguisher training had to be postponed because of our demos, but again, another activity related to that. And we are reviewing and updating emergency plans for the office and for polling places, make sure they're clear and staff safety is a priority and everything is updated. And regarding staff training, one thing I have to write it, I haven't had time to put it black and white, but I've discussed it with my staff in our meetings. We are making sure we have a written black and white policy standardized of the levels and the types of trainings that everybody gets. I've noticed that some people have had some training, some other people in the same classification haven't had in all of it, so we're trying to make sure we have to run it by HR. You know, we don't have anybody with the wrong motivation because someone else is a favorite or anything like that. Wouldn't treat everybody the same, make sure we have that in the office. So that's been part of it. And Karen and Beth and I will be attending CERA classes. That's one of the job description requirements. We have to get our CERA certification within a certain period of time. So we are going to have do a strong effort. Most of that is paid by Chapter 19 this summer and next summer to get it completed, get it done. And general activities, I listed it there, but it's not in the printed report. There are contracts that are expiring, and purchasing has been directly contacting us to say, you know, the staff temporary agency contract is expiring. We assign people to the RFP, and we get it going. So we've been developing a great relationship with purchasing. We're happy. That's going really well. And that is everything I had for today.
Any questions?
Good update.
Yeah, thank you
that's
for a
very
very
good.
thorough report.
One thing I've kind of heard in talking with some of the other judges around the state and around the country is the trend to beginning to pull voting locations out of schools. I don't know what that would do. You know, more and more, depending upon how public those locations are or how big the crowds are, is becoming a little bit more of an issue. Churches are not as much of a problem in that most of the time we're during the weekdays and their crowds are going to be on a weekend in most instances. But schools certainly are a little bit more of an issue, and you know, I've even had some schools who've said, you know, we've done this in the past, but we're beginning to at least have some second thoughts.
Okay.
I don't know that, I'm not saying that we immediately go and pull everything out, but I think we begin to look at other possible locations for that. And it's just today's environment. I'm not sure sometimes we want to take the.
Yeah, I understand. We'll start looking for
just-
alternatives, make sure we have a fresh off
I'm not
list.
asking
And
for a report on that next time or anything else. I'm just saying, file it in the back of your mind. That's something we probably ought to at least begin to consider.
for what it's worth, if we are able to go to vote centers, we will be looking probably for different kinds of locations, because you will be looking for more, for bigger areas, because you want to process more people. So that might be another reason to, that will naturally, without us wanting to push us out of schools anyway.
Any other business? I don't know of any reason why we needed a closed session. We put it on there just on the happenstance that we did, so, unless either of y'all would like to do that, then I'm gonna assume that we have no need for it, and, I see no one here willing to make, or wishing to make any, public comments, and so if there's no other business at this time, we're adjourned.